Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the first of this fall's research forums. I hope everybody had a nice July off. Today, as you well know, we're going to have two speakers with us. We're going to have Kelly Jones and Laura Carrington Obrion, really Carrington Obrion, are going to speak. And just to give you a sense or a reminder of the format of today's session is that Kelly will speak first for about a half hour, and then Carrington will speak for about a half hour, and then we'll come back together to have a discussion about what they've presented and to ask our questions. You can ask your questions in a variety of ways. You can type them into the chat, and I'm happy to read them. You can certainly unmute, that's fine too. For those of you who are here for CLE credit, at the end of the sort of session today, there'll be a QR code that is shared with you, and that'll allow you to get the credit for attending today. So I guess let's begin. This is really kind of a nice beginning to the semester, right? I mean, it gets us a little bit excited about what's about to happen in the next few weeks when classes start on campus and people start coming back into Wilson. Well, people have been here all summer, but students start coming back into Wilson Library to conduct research. Our first speaker today is Kelly Houston Jones, and Kelly was the recipient of a visiting researcher fellowship in 2024, and it was funded by the J. Carl Sitterson Fund. Kelly is an associate professor of history and graduate program director at Arkansas Tech University. Her first book, A Weary Land, Slavery on the Ground in Arkansas, was published by the University of Georgia Press and won the John William Graves Award from the Arkansas Historical Association in 2022. She is currently, and this is what brought her to us, working on a book project that seeks to uncover the history of vigilante group violence against enslaved people from the colonial era through the Civil War. So, Kelly, welcome back, at least virtually, to Wilson Library.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to participate today. So what I'd like to do first is say thank you so much to everybody at the Southern Historical Collection and at Wilson Library. The experience was so wonderful. Application experience, the visit, everything after. If there's anybody on the call who's considering applying, I hope that you will, because everything about it was just, as easy as it could be. And that's not true with everything that you can kind of get yourself into when it comes to research adventures. And if y'all will humor me, I would like to start with a cute story. I stayed in an Airbnb, a lady's basement, just at the edge of campus in Chapel Hill when I was there on my visit. And one of the amenities that was advertised was, washer and dryer down there. And that was one of the selling points for me. I didn't want to pack a bunch of stuff. I just want to wash the same stuff over. And well, as luck would have it, one or both of those wasn't working. And so this delightful lady who had Airbnb'd her basement said, come upstairs. Let's put your clothes in the washing machine. We'll have a glass of wine. We'll chat. My friend Mary is here. I think I remember that her friend's name was Mary. And it turned out that her friend who was visiting, who no longer lives in the area, was Carlisle Sitterson's daughter. And so we got to chat, and it was so delightful. It was so much fun. And so these women are, lifelong friends. And so they were just so amused by the fact that one of them's father's, research fund that the family had put together was paying for the other one's, Airbnb. It was just adorable. And what a fun part of that visit. So what I want to do is first start with kind of basically what my project is, what I've been working on. Then I'll move to highlights from this research visit. And I'm really just going to kind of work from the report that I prepared after, just kind of highlighting some collections and some things that I thought were really meaningful from that visit, and really kind of emphasize the process, sort of what made me think of this, and now I'm rethinking that, and so now I'm returning to these sources, so that you guys can kind of see kind of like that bigger, how it fits into the bigger story of what I've been working on. So I guess the first thing to say is that the project really arose out of the research that I started when I was working on my book about slavery in Arkansas. And so I had seen that there were instances in which enslaved people were lynched, almost never named, in the records that survive from that. And those instances were more frequent than I would have imagined. Logic says that there's an economic incentive to preserve Black life under slavery. So what do we do when we find out that that type of racial terror is happening in a system where people are, you would think the other aspects of the institution are locking things down in such a way that lynching wouldn't serve the same sort of function, if we can talk about it that way, as in, a later era. And so I got thinking about this, and so it really broadened my usual geographic scope for my research questions. I'm usually writing about slavery on the western edge of the South. And so this had me opening up and saying, okay, what's happening across the South? I do find that there are more frequent incidents of the lynching of enslaved people in the western South, but it is something that occurred across the South. So my research questions then included, and still do, how frequently is this happening? We're never going to know, for sure, how frequently these sort of incidents were taking place. Certainly why, in a system where when enslaved people do go to trial for the types of alleged crimes that are prompting these lynchings, when they do go to trial, they're certainly not getting a fair, treatment in this. How could they possibly? So in a system where, enslaved people are already policed in so many in legal and extra legal ways, what do we make of a phenomenon that we think of as, enforcing a regime like of Jim Crow? And so those are the kind of things that were sort of driving me. And so, like lynching in any era, your main source is the newspapers. That's where we find out that something happened. And certainly we've got to take into account that we can't understand for sure ever exactly what leads up to the incident, exactly what happens in these incidents. But the newspapers are sort of the one thing that everyone hangs on to when they're researching lynching in any period. So that's the most important source where you're going to find out whether something happened, and then sort of figure out whether it fits the definition of lynching that you're working from. But that's a very fraught source base. You can't rely only on that. And it can be really difficult to try to find out what happened and why, and to kind of move beyond just sort of tallying these incidents. So by counting in mostly newspaper accounts and some other types of sources, I've gotten to a number of about 79 incidents across the South from really the kind of 18 teens up to right at the beginning of the Civil War, about 79 incidents that fit my definition. And I can tell you guys as briefly as possible, like sort of what my parameters are. But about 96 victims. So, one incident may have more than one victim, right? So that's where those numbers come from. And so then to give people a sense, because the question I always get is like, well, what counts as lynching for the purposes of your project? Okay, so what I'm working from is a list where more than one white person kills an enslaved person, and again, not a court-ordered execution, in retaliation for a specific believed, perceived crime or trespass, or that occurs in the course of whites' fulfillment of other community enforcement measures like pursuing runaways. I'm not including instances of, say, two members of the slaveholding family killing a bondsperson as punishment for their disobedience, because those instances seem to me to be in a different spirit, concerned with narrower stakes, as in the killers are not motivated so much by a sense of, quote, justice or order at large, but they're instead focused on enforcing their rule within that household. So those types of murders don't go into my list. And I'm still trying to decide whether to include instances when the brutal physical punishment or force was intended, but the death was not intended. So say an enslaved person is killed by a group capturing them or, quote, correcting them, a term that they used at the time. I'm inclined to pull those in because those beatings were in service of the greater pursuit of racial order in the community, but for now they're in a separate file. I've also got in a separate file instances where it's a immediate reaction to an insurrection scare. So those instances where um, and I think Nat Turner would be probably the most commonly known instances where you've got a whole list of enslaved people who are immediately killed because of an insurrection or a supposed threat of one. Because those could really, in such a small data set, those could really move things around if you're trying to make determinations based on what's in the Excel sheet. And so I think those, for now, I'm kind of treating those in a separate thing. Not that they don't count per se or that they're not significant, but that's the kind of thing that's been studied quite a bit, actually. And so I'm really looking at these other instances where instead of working someone through the court system into a legal execution, the neighborhood essentially takes matters into their own hands and these kind of one or two victims at a time. Okay. And so, and that, again, that's this for now, the numbers that I'm giving people are not including the Civil War years. And that's something I'm going to have to work on with this project, is figure out if I'm going to pull this into the Civil War years or not, because even the sense of authority, sort of who's in charge, changes. So it can be really difficult to figure out what's extra legal when who's in charge and who makes the rules is constantly in flux in a lot of places in the South. So that's something I'm sort of working out. So one of the things that's interesting about going to this work with the Southern Historical Collection is that most of what's taking place in direct relation to the incidences in my data set are happening further west, okay, than what most of the collections in the Southern Historical Collection, encompass. But of course, those people are a planter in, Southeast Arkansas or in East Texas is, their daddies from South Carolina, their daddies from Virginia, or they came from North Carolina. So these are the families that sort of move over, whether they're in the slaveholding class or not. There's a lot of that. And so you're talking about questions of what are the rules in this society? What's considered appropriate ways to enforce the regime? What level of community involvement do people in the slaveholding class accept or reject? That's really, really at the heart of what I brought to my research at the Wilson Library, was how can I kind of get into their heads? Because the numbers and the sort of plotting it out on a map and, that kind of stuff, the sort of frequency, those sort of quantitative things can be really unsatisfying, right? And so we really want to find out, like, what's going on in that society. So I want to highlight some of the things from my work at the Wilson Library that really stuck out to me to help me get a glimpse of that. This is not even close to comprehensive. And I should have also said that there are a ton of things that have been digitized from the Southern Historical Collection that are I'm just not even haven't even gotten to yet. Okay, so they're actually perhaps even juicier nuggets to be had related to this project and sort of what this society is thinking once I get to the stuff that's digitized. But it's certainly what I wanted was to get in front of those papers that weren't. So let me work here from my report and say that one of the most pressing questions, well, the most pressing question I get is, well, what's lynching? What's your parameters? Okay, so there's, I hopefully satisfied you guys well enough for now with what's on my radar. The second one is, how much does this represent a wedge between the slaveholding class and other whites? Okay, because some folks I talk to are their first instinct is to say, well, maybe this is a way for poor whites to get at the planter class. And that is really not what my research has been suggesting. And so one of the things I really had on my list for my visit to the Wilson Library was to find out if there was anything that would test my hunch or reinforce my hunch here. Mostly what I'm finding is that the slaveholding families are often participating in or condoning the acts, but not as the direct individuals involved. So what I mean is that other people in the slaveholding class may take part in the lynching of an enslaved person who is held by someone else. So it's almost never that enslaver family who is taking part in the lynching, usually because that patriarch is dead, and that's the reason the lynching's happening in the first place. But also because the heirs stands to lose property. The main things that prompt, I should say, I guess, sort of trigger these lynchings are the alleged murder of an enslaver or an overseer. And we can talk about how that differs from accusations in the later era. Allegations of Black men raping white women is a more common trigger in the later era. In this time period, it's usually a white guy comes up dead, whether it's an overseer or one of these patriarchs, one of these slaveholding patriarchs, and then the community's reacting to that and blaming an enslaved person for that. So then let me sort of give you some details here this is from the Springs papers, and the Springs family is one of those they're kind of North Carolina, they're kind of South Carolina, right? They're sort of writing back and forth to each other. So in May 1849, John Springs bemoaned the fact that the local court had wasted, in his view, 2 full days on the case of an enslaved man charged with, quote, a crime of the most aggravated and atrocious character. And that's, of course, he's alluding to the rape of a white woman. Springs declared that, quote, the rascal ought to have been shot or put to instant death before he was brought there. But instead, a man held as chattel who had allegedly violated a white person received due process. Springs wrote with disgust that the enslaved man had been, quote, defended by a strong array of counsel who rejected not less than 30 jurors and observed all the forms and ceremonies that could have been resorted to in the defense of the most distinguished citizen of the U.S. And the strong exertions were made to screen him from the justice of the law, as it would be a loss of $600 or $700 to his owner. So the enslaved man received a guilty sentence and faced hanging the next month. And so again, we understand that the legal system is nowhere near fair and balanced to enslaved people for a whole host of reasons. Springs' comments are then even more interesting. So he understood that the man would hang anyway, probably, but he was frustrated that they even bothered to go through the process. Okay, this whole, and then he had counsel to defend him, but he notes that, of course, this is because of the economic incentive of the person claiming that man as property. Springs, of course, is firmly inside the slaveholding class. So he's saying this as a fellow enslaver. He's saying your property should have been destroyed by the community without due process. You should have lost that $700. And he says that as someone who's in that class. And so this is one of those things. And again, when you're working with a topic that has so little to go on to try to understand what's going on here, this is worth gold to me for someone within the slaveholding class to kind of talk about like how they see like their frustrations with the incident that they know of, okay, in their community. Certainly Springs doesn't speak for everybody, right? And that's the problem we have always, as researchers, is try to see like what kind of sort of sampling we can get and find out what's going on with different folks. The George Washington Allen papers provide evidence of a more tempered reaction to the specter of violence at the hands of enslaved people. J.S. Allen wrote to his son, George W. Allen, in Alabama in September 1849, reacting to the news that their friend had been killed perhaps by an enslaved man named John, and that other whites had been threatened in the neighborhood. Allen also feared for the safety of his daughter, who was nearby, and he wrote, quote, language fails me to give you a proper and correct idea of feeling, and in regard, O God, of that awful murder. And to think he should be murdered in so horrid a manner, referring to his friend, in his own house and in the midst of his family. A circumstance and outrage on humanity, reason, and common feeling that is too much for us and country to bear. So with these strong feelings, he also says it is horrid to learn that suspicion should rest upon one of his slaves, and that one that he had raised. But if he be guilty, I am bound to think some white person is concerned. I trust in my heavenly Father that all concerned will be found out and suffer agreeable to law and justice for this unmerciful murder. Now, Springs also used the words justice, maybe also, justice and right. Anyway, definitely justice. He's also using that same word, but he was saying that this person should have been lynched, right? That would have been justice. But it kind of feels here that, to me, my sense is that George W. Allen is saying, well, okay, like, let's just, see, let's sort of like let the process play out. He doesn't call for anyone's head, even though his own family was sort of threatened, in his view, by what went on. He also, with those quotations, the quotations that I just read from his letter, he's also articulating just why these sort of attacks are so terrifying to whites, especially when they come from inside, right, their own household, is that the white household is so threatened, okay, by the specter of this. So he articulates that in a way that I definitely could see, certainly framed with the existing scholarship as, I would say, pretty representative, okay, of how a white planter would view that at that time. So one thing to say about this is that both of those examples that I have are from 1849. Things change, and if you know anything about the Civil War era and sort of the coming of the war, then you know that in the mid-1850s, the climate becomes even more intense in that sectional crisis. The creation of the Republican Party, the fear among whites of what they called, quote, Black Republicanism, really heightens the willingness of white Southerners to exact violence on enslaved people. And I mean extra-legal vigilante violence on enslaved people, but also on other white people who they suspect to be, abolitionists. And so really things kind of pick up, my numbers pick up in sort of like tracking these once you get to the mid to late 1850s. And it's sort of no wonder if you look and see the rhetoric at the time. So those are just a couple of snippets of the kinds of things that I've been watching for, kinds of things that I'm looking for. I've got a couple of other incidences where the white writer of the letter is saying, these things are so scary, all of this stuff, we don't know if there's some kind of insurrection. I wish they would just kill them all. I wish they would just hang them all. And in the report that I sent in, those are the last two things. I think those are the last two things that I mentioned there, is that you can really get a sense of the, I don't want to say hysteria, I want to say sort of paranoia, that fear, that really intense fear that whites have, which would lead them to maybe shed some of the inhibitions, right, that they would have had in earlier eras. So then to kind of like back up again, the project that I'm working on, I'm looking at vigilante killings of enslaved people across the South from the colonial era, which I didn't really talk about here, and it's just kind of a big messy thing to try to like work in, to the Civil War. But probably to satisfy my readers, I'm going to have to say something, okay, about the war, to sort of get in there and at least talk about what issues that brings up, right? But this was a project that I had undertook really in earnest because of a sabbatical in fall 2024. It's so hard. So much time has passed. Fall 2024, and I made several visits and I'm still making visits to various archives. So this is just sort of one little bite of what the kinds of things that I was able to find combing through the manuscript collections at the Southern Historical Collection back in, I guess it was November, anyway, back in the fall. And then I'm still chewing on, and then leading me to one of the incidents that's mentioned that I didn't quote from here, led me to some newspaper accounts and actually some other things that weren't on my list already. So such a fruitful, use of time and energy, and I'm so appreciative to have been supported. So fruitful in the obvious ways, but also those sort of spin-off, things that, where one thing, leads you to another. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. It's really nice for you to come and share this with us, and I'm sure we'll have questions after Carrington speaks. So our second speaker today is Carrington Obrion, and she is a PhD candidate at the University of Virginia, where she studies the history of theater segregation in the 19th century American South. Carrington was a research fellow here in July of 2024. She was the recipient of a slightly different sort of fellowship than Kelly. Kelly was here for 2 weeks, but Carrington was here for a month. And she was receiving the Southern Studies Doctoral Fellowship, and that was funded by a fund called the Joe Williamson Fund. Did you meet Joe Williamson's relatives by any chance?
No, I don't have that.
Yeah, I feel like you've been
Right?
been neglected. Well, I'm going to stop talking and let you talk about what you found and what you've been doing. Thank you.
I'm gonna go ahead and share. And then how does that look? Good?
Sorry, it looks good. Yeah.
Okay, great. Awesome. All right. So like Matt said, my name is Carrington Obrion. I'm going to be talking about my research, which has to do with performance, and what I kind of found when I was in Chapel Hill. So there we go. So like Matt said, I received the Joel Williamson Fund Southern Historical Collection doctoral fellowship, and my research has to do with the South because I'm writing about segregation in theaters in the US in the 19th century, and much of that segregation was in the American South. And I also want to just thank everyone at the Wilson because it was such an amazing experience for me. It was the first fellowship that I completed in the last year, and it really provided useful framing information for me that I needed to kind of guide the research I've been doing in the year since then. It was a great way to start my research because I really had time to kind of dive really deep into collections that might not be specifically focused on theater. And what that means is that I was able to see how ordinary people were having encounters with theater in the 19th century. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today represents interesting examples of wider patterns that become much clearer in things like legal sources, playbills, and collections that are much more focused on theater. And those are the kind of collections that I'm able to focus on now, a year later, but I really got a lot of context and information when I was at the Wilson because I had the time to kind of comb through these collections that were more general. So these are kind of the big questions that guide my dissertation research as a whole. Big question is, why were theaters some of the very first places to segregate in the South, as early as the 18th century? How did theater segregation work? Was it legal? Was it by social custom? Was it by business mandate? And then who attended theater? Big question that actually is very hard for scholars to pinpoint and a big focus of my research. And then how did emancipation and industrialization that happened in the second half of the 19th century change the theater industry itself? So those last two questions are the big ones I'm going to be talking about today because that's kind of what I focused on when I was at UNC. And then this is just a great headline from Roland Holt, who his papers are at UNC, and he had a lot of big ideas about how theater should be in the US and how America should be by way of the theater. So this is a headline where he's talking about that. So when people think about theater audiences, I think they usually take what they think about Broadway and then they just kind of place it back into the 19th century. So when they think about 19th century theater, I think they're thinking a lot about, this is a scene from the Gilded Age. If you watch the Gilded Age, rich white New Yorkers going to the Metropolitan Opera, and that's kind of where it ends. And these type of people definitely went to the theater in the South as well as in New York. They went all the time in the 19th century, very often. But what you might not know, or what you might not think of, is that for much of the century, especially the first half, they were sharing the space of the theater with people like this. So a lot of my research focuses on finding out the diversity of the early audiences, because they left behind far fewer records than rich people like on the Gilded Age. So one of the most surprising groups that regularly came to the Playhouse were soldiers. And we have lots of evidence of this because in the Civil War, soldiers were writing diaries and letters at a higher rate than they would have before the war. So we have more description of just kind of what they were doing. Soldiers would regularly attend the theater while on leave, and they would also perform in camp together. Theater was a very universally understood language for a diverse group of people with really different backgrounds, different levels of literacy. And Shakespeare was especially popular because it was super well known to many, many Americans. And one of the diaries I looked at was Bruno Tremblay's diary, and I'll talk about that in just a second because it's a really good example of how soldiers interacted with a theater. And I'm also very focused on documenting African American theater attendance in the 19th century. So one of the most famous Black people with connections to the theater is Gilbert Hunt. He is pictured here. Hunt was enslaved in the theater district in Richmond, Virginia in 1811. And he saved about a dozen women from this huge disaster, which was the Richmond Theater Fire. It killed about 76 people. And it's important to my project because those deaths represent some of the first evidence that we have of Black theater attendance in the US. And then lastly, something I found surprising last summer was this really strong presence of children and families in the second half of the 19th century in the collection. After Reconstruction, there's this ongoing effort to make theaters more elite, more white, and more socially acceptable, seen as more safe. And so to do that, theater managers began to aggressively promote to women and children. And child actors were part of that. So this child actor's name is Billy, and he was a child actor in the early 20th century. And his mother's diaries, which are at the Wilson, they show the touring industry that kind of integrated to the South into a national theater market. So because people were traveling around and doing the same thing, it sort of was more of a national culture than it had been before. So what people were seeing in New Orleans or Cincinnati was very similar to what they were seeing in Boston or Philadelphia. And this diary is really interesting for many reasons, but one of them is her encounters with African Americans in the South. The mom is from New York, and her encounters reveal how she has deep-seated racism towards people that she meets, African Americans in the South. But they also offer proof of Black employees in Southern theaters, which is a phenomenon that I have been trying to document. And there's very, very little evidence, although it did happen, it was common, but there's just not a lot of records that show us, okay, what kind of jobs were African Americans performing? Where were they performing them? And that's just because theater records don't survive often, or this isn't something that people would talk about very much in things like letters. So it's very valuable for that reason. And so those are just a couple of examples. I'm going to talk about some more. But I think they really make clear what this is a very famous kind of early argument about this phenomenon from Lawrence Levine, where he's talking about how in the first half of the 19th century, theaters are like movie theaters. This is where everyone goes. It's democratic, lots of different types of people, lots of different types of things on stage, and that changes. And I really argue, and this is kind of what I'm coming to in terms of my dissertation, that a lot of that change has to do with the failure of Reconstruction, the failure to desegregate theaters, and that kind of creates this elite white theater that we think of when we think of like the Gilded Age. So as I mentioned, Bruno Tremblay's diary is a really fascinating source. It's digitized. It's hilarious. It is about this soldier who he first came to, he was a peddler from New York, and he first came south in 1862 as a soldier in the infantry, and then he ended the war serving in the USCT. And he was extremely down on his luck in 1866. His business had failed. He needed money, and he was in New Orleans waiting for a job. But he didn't want to go back to New York because he didn't have money, and his wife was going to say, "Where's your paycheck?" So he was just kind of hanging out in New Orleans, talking a lot about being bored. And a lot of what he did was play cards, go to fancy dinners, and meet up with girls, as he called them, and go to the theater. And this is really interesting because he did not have money. A lot of people say, oh, well, why did working class people go to the theater if they did not, how could they afford it? Well, people prioritized entertainment and social life even when they couldn't afford it. So he isn't a great example. He is constantly talking. His diary starts in January, and he has a lot of New Year's resolutions. He's constantly talking about how he's not going to drink anymore. He's not going to go to the theater. He's not going to cheat on his wife anymore. And then the next day he talks about how that's what he did. So it's very lively and interesting to read. And then this is one of my favorite little quotes that he has when he's saying, "I have to stop. Farewell to all the fun." Luckily, a few days after he wrote this, he did get his commission. So he was out in New Orleans. And I think it's really shows how in 1866, these theaters are not elite spaces. Rich people might go to the theater, but in the gallery, there's going to be sex workers, people like Tremblay, working class people. It's a really mixed space. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the Beatty family papers, which they represent, I think, how much had changed after Reconstruction came through Louisiana. The family's early letters reveal a very interesting Protestant taste for New Orleans. One of them calls it the Devil's Punch Bowl in New Orleans. But by 1883, the patriarch of this family is regularly taking his very young children to the theater. They're 13, 10, and 11 months at the time of this diary. And his diary is notable for what it tells us and what it does not tell us. So the entries kind of portray him as this farmer who's family oriented. He's taking his family to entertainment, a lot of which actually features Black performers or anti-slavery sentiment. But what you do not see in the diary is Taylor's plantation empire, his power as a judge and politician, or the actual nature of the performances that he attended. So in 1887, Taylor Beatty helped lead an extremely violent suppression of Black plantation workers who were organizing for better wages. It's known as the Thibodeau Massacre. And in it, white vigilantes killed 60 African Americans in a single day. And Taylor does not reference his commitment to white supremacy in the diary. Instead, he just talks about his mundane kind of lifestyle, the things he does, like going to the theater. And I think what it does show is that by 1883, New Orleans theaters were now a draw for rich white people. 1883 is the same year that the Supreme Court ruled that theaters could discriminate based on race. So in 1875, that became illegal, but by 1883, they were allowed to do that. So it was fully segregated by this time, or I wouldn't even use the word segregated because almost certainly it almost became an all-white space. So as theaters became more white, Black performers like those that Taylor saw actually became more popular, which it explains why he's going to see shows like Uncle Tom's Cabin. He's going to see, he went to see someone called Blind Tom, who was a Black performer, but they were typically in these demeaning roles. So Uncle Tom's Cabin went from being an anti-slavery work to being a minstrel show. For wealthy Southerners like Beatty, the theater was a comfortable place to think about ideas about slavery and race. And I think it's really important because the messages that are imparted to these kids have a lasting impact. This picture is actually Charlton that's mentioned in the diary. He was 13 at the time. This is him as an adult, and he became a federal judge. So you think about, if this is part of his daily life, interesting to think about how that may have affected him. So once we kind of learn who is in the theater, I think you start to see these changes over time. And that got me thinking about how Americans coped with the change, which is a lot of what I saw in the archive, and how they viewed their own experience through the lens of performance. One thing that shows that really well is the Lagarde scrapbook, which is a really interesting scrapbook. It has materials from the 1850s to the 1870s about this fascinating family. So the family included the black and white photo, Ernest Lagarde, who was a professor of Shakespeare, and it may be that he made the scrapbook. It also features materials about his uncle that raised him, Alexander Dmitri. He was the literary and dramatic editor at the New Orleans Times, and he was the first person of color to be ambassador to Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And he also served in the Confederate government, which is fascinating. His mother is this woman here, Marianne Celeste Dragon, who was an extremely famous Creole landowner, and her mother was enslaved. So it's a fascinating family. As New Orleans started to become more repressive to families like this, Creole families of color, the family actually legally kind of fabricated Native ancestry in order to be legally considered white. And I think this news article, which someone clipped out and put in the scrapbook, right? Someone thought this was interesting. This article is talking about these tricky racial categories, how we classify people in terms of, if we're going to have segregation, how are we going to classify people? And it uses Othello as an example, which is really fascinating to me, especially when you think about the decisions that this family was making, their connection to theater, and just kind of what was going on at the time. There's no commentary, right? This person just cut it out and put it in the scrapbook, but I think it says a lot. So finally, as we are thinking about the huge changes that happened during the Gilded Age, Margaret Vail is a wonderful example of this, and her papers are fascinating. I really encourage anyone who's interested to look at them. So she was a woman who loved theatrical stories her whole life, and we know that because the collection literally begins with her birth announcement and has like children's little letters she wrote as a toddler. And she was very into stories when she was a kid. She talks about that in these toddler letters. And the collection also has, in the 1890s, she went abroad and she went to many, many plays, and she had this deep interest in theater, which is interesting because her father was a South Carolina minister. So this is interesting because it's telling us that attitudes about theater are changing, especially among religious people in the South, and especially about women. So Margaret is growing up in a generation where women had begun to seek formal education, which she did. She went to college, and to cultivate rich intellectual lives. In her teen years in the collection, you see she's writing scripts. And then by 1912, she actually moves to New York to try to seek a career on Broadway, which is kind of wild because she's married. But it really shows she has this new ability for wealthy white women to fuse their private and public lives without encountering social ruin. She's allowed to do this. So she's, rather than being shamed for this desire, she's constantly telling newspapers that it's allowed because her uncle by marriage is President Woodrow Wilson. So she's saying President Woodrow Wilson has said he makes no objection, he wishes me success, and this is actually fine. Which is fascinating because her husband and her were living separately. She hadn't seen him in a long time. She lived in New York. Her husband was in North Carolina. And her papers are so fascinating. They contain so much about their marriage that I don't have time to get into, but it's really interesting if you're interested in kind of women's roles at that time. But for my purposes, they really reveal increasingly how elite and wealthy Southerners were using the stage to suddenly be an acceptable way to promote social causes. So she's saying, even though her real desire is to be a star, She's saying her desire is to use the stage to promote women's suffrage and eugenics, two of the most popular causes of women at her time. So while the increasingly elite reputation of the theater really benefited Margaret Vale, who you'll see in this picture, this is a women's suffrage march where she's Alaska, it nevertheless really narrowed the audience for theater, because if the president's niece is going to be on stage, then men like Bruno Tremblay are not going to be in that same theater, right? This needs to be separated if we're going to keep if we're going to have a sort of high level of high culture, as Lawrence Lemming would call it. So by 1920, like I said, men like Bruno Tremblay or African Americans like Gilbert Hunt would be attending movie theaters, vaudeville houses, and African American owned theaters and clubs. So women like Vale would dominate Broadway. So there's this huge separation. And America's theaters by that time had become separated by both race and class. And I would say what I find interesting in this research is that the industry is still trying to reverse that process, right? They're still trying to reach out to average people, to diversify, all of that. So thank you, especially, as I said, to everyone at the Wilson who were unbelievably helpful. And also thank you all for coming and listening. I really look forward to any questions you might have.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So we have 20 minutes or so, maybe even 30, to have a discussion with each other about the talks that we had today and their experiences here. So I'm asking, everybody in the audience, does anybody have a question that they would like to ask? You could certainly send it through the chat. I'm happy to read it. Or if you raise your hand, we could also allow you to ask it directly. I guess while we wait for them to consider, it's always slow to get a question. I wonder, one of the things that you both have is a very traditional archival problem. You're looking for very specific things in very non-specific groups of papers. That people did a lot of things, including going to the theater, and people did a lot of things, including participate in mass violence or watch mass violence or gossip about it. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you found the collections, what drew you to them, what were the tells that you saw that made it worth you pursuing a deep reading of what was going on there? In no particular order.
I can go first. I would say that finding needs are incredibly helpful, right? Like that is the most helpful thing, especially when you have a keyword like theater or playhouse or performance. So that's always important when I'm doing my research. And also UNC has still has a kind of great theater at UNC, and so there are collections related to that, which made me want to come and apply. That's important. And then I think newspapers, like a lot of times you can kind of get a sense of what's going on in a newspaper and then go and look at that person's papers. But I think both types of research are really helpful, like I said, because I think more recently I've been doing much more specific research, going to a theater collection of a manager of a theater in the 1850s and reading their letters, right? But that's going to give you a very particular view on theater that does not really cover, okay, how often was just the average person going? What did they think about it? So I think if you have the time, which was why this was a great experience for me, I was able to kind of look at a lot of stuff that might be useful, might not. And some things I looked at, they did not say anything that was interesting, but a lot of things I got there and I found, and I thought, oh, this is kind of something I didn't know was there. And you just kind of have to work through that. Yeah.
That was one of the hopes, right, of being able to pay people to actually come, is to give you a little bit of time to look at the non-obvious, to explore in a way that the time pressures, right, of life and limited funds sort of push you to certain well-known paths. So yeah, there's a beauty to that. Kelly, did you have
Sure. I have really been like, all of us, I guess, just super dependent on the very meticulous finding aid descriptions that folks not only taking the time to create those with the level of detail, but then to make that available, so that, not just the general description of the collection is online, but sometimes, that more detailed kind of piece by piece version being available. That has just been such a lifesaver for me. And so what I've done, and definitely what I did in this case, was put in terms that I thought would grab pieces of collections where folks are talking about. I've got a lot. I kind of took off the table reactions to insurrections for definitely for what I've talked about today, but certainly for when people are looking for numbers from me, on this. But that was one of the first places that I looked for, trying to find out if there would be letters that would have, or diaries, certainly. But it's usually, it's been correspondence where people are reacting to rumors of insurrections or things they've heard about, and maybe they really were violent incidents that took place, and what they end up hearing is some inflated version of it, or whatever. So just, simple term, putting in murder, kill, all the kind of things, that would, insurrection, rebellion, all the kind of things that would pull them even talking about that kind of stuff, if that kind of thing was described, in the finding aid. But I also made sure to search for execution, because that's a term that sometimes people use, whether it's a legal execution or not, or what I mean by that is a court-ordered execution or not. But also, one of the things of interest for my project were situations where the legal process is followed. Why is the process followed in, like, here but not there? And then certainly, what kind of conversation are we maybe catching in the letters as they observe those things or take part in those things in their community? So just trying to be strategic with the terms, but then certainly moving more broadly. I did some laser strikes on my relatively short visit. I knew that this letter dated this, and this folder in this collection, I'm going to go straight here. And I had kind of a long list of like little bits, but would also try to like move backwards and then go forward a little bit. I just gave you guys such a tiny little snippet of the harvest, okay, of these sources, but sometimes you can catch that conversation about whatever incident gets noted in the finding aid. That conversation starts maybe 2 letters before. And then maybe they keep talking about it later. But certainly when you're making that finding aid, you can't just sort of transcribe every letter, for everyone. And so that was a fruitful, strategy for me. But but it's got to be said, I guess, that finding out what the enslaved community, how they thought about and experienced these things, was something that I know, that it's almost impossible, to find, but there was some hope that perhaps by their movements and how whites perceived their actions and reactions, that I could get some kind of sense of whether these sorts of vigilante activities were things that were anticipated perhaps or not. For example, clues of, once someone is found dead or there is some rumor of some scare, am I getting a sense from that document that enslaved people are fleeing, like in anticipation of something, some kind of retaliatory violence, or are they blindsided by, are they sort of before they even know what's happened, maybe the wheels are already in motion for some kind of sense of community, justice, and accusations flying. So some little hope that there may be something through that very cloudy view, getting me to that aspect as well. But again, just hitting the kind of search terms that seem like they would fit.
Yeah. I mean, it's a problematic, well, all sources are problematic, but I do wonder about something like the narratives that were collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 30s of formerly enslaved people, because they are tacked to geography. Um, and if you know the geography, clearly you know the geography because you've talked about there being more incidents that fit your definition in the western part than the eastern. So that might be something. We do have two questions from folks here. Kyla Connors writes, did you find that your research tended to guide your questions, as in the more you discovered, the more new questions came up, or did your original questions guide the direction of your research? So yeah, this is good. So the impact of colliding with the archive, right? There's always the dreamt of archive and the sort of the idealized archive, but then what does it do to you as a historian constructing questions to plumb?
Yeah, I think for sure everything changes. Like every new questions come all the time. I think for me, I'm trying to keep those initial questions really big, because then you have the opportunity to incorporate what you find. Um, I know for me, I don't think I really realized I would be talking so much about class. My initial questions were much more about race, especially about legal segregation. And so it was really, I think, through just reading how different sources are, because you really get a sense of someone's position in life, their education level, and then to realize they're all going to the theaters and how their theater preferences change over time was fascinating to me, because the way that theater history has been written is very class oriented. It almost doesn't talk about race at all. So I think it gave me a sense of, oh, that's why people in the past have focused on class, but also, okay, now what can I learn about that and what does it have to do with race? And so, I think you just kind of keep on learning and keep on being open, because I think that is something that, especially still being in graduate school, you can have this kind of panic, like I'm not finding what I want or all of that. I think we should talk about that more, because I think that's part of the process, and you may find something and then 6 months later realize what it actually means or how you're going to understand it. But it is this process of going in and kind of like being very vulnerable, because you're really hoping, right, for something. So it was, once again, it was just really good to have the time and not feel like if I don't find something today, it's a terrible thing, right? It's okay because I had many days there. So yeah.
Not to keep coming back to the fellowships, but part of this is an advertisement to get people to apply. One of the things that we again hoped for was that people could test out their ideas against an archive. And often I find that in these sorts of discussions with people that are both graduate students and more senior scholars, um, things change quite considerably. And it's a normal part. At least that's the way they've expressed it to me. I was, I didn't mean to sort of jump in there, Kelly. I was just talking from the research desk point of view of what goes on here.
Right. Often the project will tell you what is required, as you get into the sources. I think the big example for me would be that I had planned to work on this project to try to help us think about and get close to answering some questions about these extra legal killings of enslaved people from about the time that we think of lynching, like as a concept really existing, about mid 1830s. Into, and then sort of figuring out what I'm going to say about the Civil War and how deep I'm going to get. But what I found was that there's this really essential foundational policing history that long predates the concept of lynching the way we think of it, but is absolutely extra legal, lethal violence against enslaved people in order to reinforce the regime. And that's the practice of outlawry statutes. And this is where, if I can just sort of geek out for a second with you guys, with this history, the during the colonial era, before these places are states, North Carolina and Virginia both had, they're sort of like the biggest examples of colonies and then later states that had statutes on the books that said that if an enslaved person's declared outlawed, and there's a process for that, then any person could kill that enslaved person, and then the colony, later state, would reimburse the enslaver for that. It's not truly a bounty because the person who's doing the killing is not by the statute getting anything in payment for that. But of course, you can imagine that enslavers would advertise rewards, knowing that then they're going to get reimbursed from the colony, later the state. And so while in my data set that I have, I may have one or two incidences of sort of how I described my scope for North Carolina. Outlawry was something that was on the books in North Carolina into the Civil War. And I can't tell you yet how many people were actually declared outlawed and destroyed, to use their term, under the statute and then reimbursements. But I know that it was frequently enough in the earlier period that there was a pre-printed form that was printed out that the person could fill out to describe, who's and then Harriet Beecher Stowe writes about this in her novel Dread. And so there's all this history related to this that pulled me into a time period that I had no intention of engaging with because I'm not trained as a colonial historian. But what it did was force me to ask questions about the roots of what we recognize as lynching in the later period, involving white folks other than that slaveholding family or that class, and recapturing enslaved people. This sense that it's the community's problem and that the state has some kind of, I'm not claiming that those murders were lynchings, but this cloaked in the protection of the state. But that there's something going on there that I think I will probably argue is planting the seeds for what goes on later. So the same types of anxieties, which I think are related to the environment, the dismal swamp. There's a reason that North Carolina and Virginia had these. Those anxieties get moved westward. And so while North Carolina is almost absent in the data I have from, the earlier 19th century on, the colonial period is heavily weighted if you're looking at that vigilante violence in the form of outlawry. It's weighted more towards that area of the South in this colonial era, I've had to spend a whole lot of time sort of getting my feet under me and sort of trying to figure that out. And it's taking up a huge part of the project that I could never have anticipated. So sometimes you just got to go. I mean, the questions will lead you like the question we got that got this conversation going. The question leads you to more questions, right? And so you end up having to just kind of follow, even if it can be really way out of your, usual territory.
Yeah, thank you both. And thank you, Kyla. That's a wonderful question. Yeah, it's interesting thinking about what you were saying, Kelly, this almost idea of the pattern of behavior following the frontier, sort of the underdeveloped, occupied but underdeveloped structures in those spaces. Soren Smith asks a question, and this is probably primarily directed to Carrington, but one can jump in. In Northern theaters, would their performances push for social change that would challenge Southern social change?
Yeah, this is a super good question. I would say theater is basically always about profit margin. So very rarely was it kind of used for this like high, especially in the 19th century, like highly moral, sort of like trying to change people's minds through art, which is kind of like how we think of art now, is like it's very like above it all, but that's not how they were thinking of it. And so I just want to recommend a book by Douglas Jones, who is at Duke. It's a really good book, which is called The Captive Stage. And it's about how there was actually a lot of pro-slavery theater being put on in the North, in the antebellum North. And he kind of argues that it really was about kind of getting African Americans and white people together and saying, yeah, we don't have slavery anymore, after it was and did in New York, but we still have racial hierarchy, and this is how it's going to be. So kind of a way of sort of teaching social order through the theater. So that's a really good book on that topic. And I think the big exception is Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? But it was the most popular show, and more people saw Uncle Tom's Cabin than read it. And the show it was not really anti-slavery, especially in its later iterations. It was really a minstrel show. So I think sometimes people think, oh, Uncle Tom's Cabin was so important and so popular, but people like Taylor Beatty were going to see it really as a way to just have nostalgia for the plantation era rather than having the original anti-slavery push that it originally had.
So generally you're not seeing any sort of like regional corpora developing in terms of like this is particularly popular here, this is particularly popular there. It's more nationalized.
Yeah, it really is. And part of the reason of that is the star system, because stars like Edwin Booth, John Wilkes Booth, people like that, they in the 19th century are touring the whole country, and they come in to a place like Richmond, Virginia. They know a certain amount of roles, and then the company that's there performs with them. Usually, sometimes a company travels at the same time. It kind of depends, but it really requires everyone to kind of know the same stuff, which is why Shakespeare was so popular. And I'm not an expert on the actual material being done. So I'm sure there are some regional differences, but I think it is interesting. I have written a lot about Othello, and I think that's something where you would think, oh, like that probably wasn't being done in the South, right? It has an interracial marriage, but in fact, it was very popular in the South. And a lot of the plays they're doing are British plays, so it's kind of like a very like similar, people are going from place to place and saying, okay, I'm doing King Lear tonight, Othello tomorrow, and then I'm going to do this farce. And then right. So it's very generalized, which I think is interesting because there wasn't that much mass culture then, right? So yeah.
So we're at about almost 1:10. Does anybody else have any questions that they'd like to ask? And thank you, Soren. That's a really great question. If not, I wondered, did you all have any questions for each other? So I do like to give an opportunity for people to ask each other rather than just to hog it all for our needs.
I actually do have a question. I know that you mentioned in your definition enslaved people. Are you including any free people? And if so, why or why not?
Thank you. Oh, well, for the main work that I've got going, I'm focusing on enslaved people. I have another sheet I'm telling you literally how I'm doing. I have another sheet in my Excel sheet that includes free Blacks. And then I think I've got one actually on white supposed abolitionists or for whatever, but usually it's because they're supposed abolitionists. I wrote an encyclopedia entry for Michael Pfeiffer's upcoming lynching encyclopedia, and it had a much broader scope. And so that got me thinking about, this. So I think that the finished book will have some discussion of free Blacks in the South who are lynched or threatened with lynching, but hopefully it will be enough to spur people to take that on and dig into it further. But I don't think that it'll be, because my essential questions are about, for a person who is held as chattel, what is lynching and what does lynching mean when that person is the victim of this form of enforcement? Not that free Blacks aren't relevant, but that there's something essentially different going on with what their normal legal rights are, although they're actually sort of similar. I mean, in most of these states, I'm sure I can probably find one or two exceptions depending on what time you're looking, but generally enslaved people had rights to trial and defense for crimes that they've allegedly, committed, and were very often defended all the way up to a state Supreme Court, handing down whether they're going to uphold or not, certainly because of that profit incentive. Free blacks, of course, wouldn't have had that. And so there's really kind of, although there's so many similar things, legally there's such different positions that they're in, that I'll probably do enough to kind of get some of that conversation going, and then hope that someone, takes it on. But I have a question for you, Laura Carrington Obrion, if we've got time. I was wondering about how often would a novel or a serial novel, or how that sort of fiction came to folks in that era, how often that would be adapted, and what that would mean for the content, sort of how racialized the content is.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would not say that I know a ton about that, but I do know, I look at a lot of playbills, and in the playbills, there are a lot of shows that were formerly novels. But something interesting in this period is like the establishment of copyright law. So before copyright law, people were just playing fast and loose, and it's very hard to know what was happening on stage because we obviously don't have recordings. So you get the sense there's something called a prompt book, which is like a script. And so you can see, especially in Shakespeare, like people in the 19th century love to edit out the bad endings and make it a happy ending in Shakespeare in the 18th and 19th century. And so you can see that in prompt books, but and so certainly that was happening with all kinds of different material. They're kind of changing it, especially for like the audience. I just read a diary of a kind of minor actor, and he was performing with Edwin Forrest, who is an extremely famous actor. And he says, oh, when Edwin Forrest is Othello, he cuts these lines. And I don't like that. I don't think you should do that. So I think, this is before directors really. So the actors have so much control. People often do not have the source material, so they are not holding them accountable in any way. But I spent the spring at the Folger Shakespeare Library looking at Augustin Daly's records, and he was like the first big Broadway producer, and he was suing people all the time for this new copyright law where people were stealing from plays that he had written or produced, and he would write them a letter and say, you owe me this amount of money because I own he actually is the first person that had a scene of like a woman tied on a railroad track and the train coming, and he tried to copyright that idea, and anytime someone would use it, he would like sue them. So I think there's a very different, before that idea of like copyright law and everyone having like mass print culture, people just had a different relationship to performance, I think, than they do now. You don't really get people talking very much about like, oh, the source material, that kind of thing, except for Shakespeare, I think, because it was so like important to people. So yeah, it's a good question. I'm sure there's some good work on that too.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting to think of the liberties that people take. And I think infringement, that's interesting that it was coming into play as strongly as that. Well, thank you both. This has been really enjoyable. It's so nice. And thank you all for coming. I see my colleague Nadia has put the QR code in there if you need that. I guess the last thing I would say to the two of you, and one of the things that I think Kelly said in particular about the digitized material that we have available, I would say in general, our online readers still not great. So that if you see digitized content, you should just write us and we could send you the underlying PDF, and that'll save you. It looks like Julia Bettis has raised her hand. Let me see. Oh, Nadia, Julia is writing that she cannot see the QR code. So I don't know if that's something you could address.
Yep, I'll put it up right now. I also put a link in the chat that you can follow, but I'll put the QR code up right now.
Oh, okay. Thanks. So anyway, I would invite you all just to be sure to write me rather than go through that sort of exercise in frustration. All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Nadia. If anybody has any difficulties with this, we'll stay on the line for just a few minutes, so you can write us. And Kelly and Carrington, I just wanted to thank you again so much, and we're not going to hold you here while we figure out the QR codes. So I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We really appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Nadia.
You're welcome.
I guess we can hang on till the participants
Yeah.
drop down, make sure that they get it.
Yeah, if anyone is having trouble with the QR code or the link, I don't know. Let me check the link. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, guys.
I guess I should also say, let's
Oh,
see.
we've got a hand raised. You should be able to talk.
Let's see what's going
For
on.
some reason, when I'm scanning the QR code, I can't see it doesn't say like your attendance has been recorded or anything like that.
Did you log in? It should ask you for Duo security. That's what it does for me.
Yeah,
Did you get through that part?
yeah, I did. And then usually I feel like it says like at the top your attendance has been recorded after I like log in, but it doesn't say that for this one.
Okay. Huh, okay. Mine says that. If you, I'm gonna put my email address. If you email me and just check in, and I can see if we can figure out if it actually worked or not. So maybe it wasn't.
Okay, sounds good. It just says the chat is disabled for Zoom on my end, but I don't know if I can still see your messages or I just can't.
Okay. Can you see my messages? And Alexandra, if you have something to add, you are able to unmute yourself.
No, I still can't see it.
You don't see the code or it doesn't go through?
It doesn't go through and I can't see the chat at all.
Yeah, I can't
Okay,
see
you
the
can't
chat
see that.
either.
You guys can't see the chat. Okay, let's see.
Mhm.
I can change that. Okay, I'm gonna put, let me edit this. I'll put my, okay, can y'all see my email address on
Yes.
the slides? Oops,
Yep.
hang on, it's coming. Okay, there we go. Okay, and then I can, Alexandra, excuse me, send that to you, and see if it goes through, and then Cure, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah.
Okay, Cure, check in with me and we'll figure out how to go in, and make sure that that it worked or not.